Good morning. Welcome to the June 14th Planning Commission meeting. We have a very full agenda today. There are 2 committee reports and 7 other discussion items. I'll also note we have a hard stop at 12:10 when we will be losing a quorum. So let's be mindful about getting through as many items on the agenda as we possibly can. We start every agenda with the opportunity for the public to comment on an item not contained on the agenda. Are there any members of the public here to speak on an item that is not on the agenda? No? Moving forward to the consent agenda. Consent agenda items are considered routine, and we can enact this in one motion. This does not designate the final disposition of the case. Rezoning case Z1122 is on the consent agenda today. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda item and defer the request to the June 28th meeting?
Motion to approve the consent agenda.
And do I have a second? And by show of hands, those in favor? Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the committee reports. There are 2 items under the committee reports today, Z1822, which is the Western Boulevard BRT Transit Overlay District, and Z1922, which is the Southern TOD along South Wilmington Street between downtown Raleigh and Garner. Both of these items were intended to be heard at a meeting in which we did not have a quorum. So we are asking for an extension of 45 days on both of these items. Do I have a motion to approve the staff recommendation for an extension on both of those items?
Motion to approve the extension of 45 days for Z1822 and Z1922.
Thank you, Commissioner Bennett. And there's our second?
Second.
By show of hands, those in favor? Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the old business portion of the agenda, these are items where we have heard staff presentation, applicant presentation, and heard from the public previously. We will start with a staff update on Z6621.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission. Don Bell, Comprehensive Planning. Quick update on this rezoning request, which you heard previously. It is at 3900 Mitchell Mill Road. 2.0 acres of the total site are requested to be rezoned from R4 to CX3CU. Note the portions of this site that are within the floodplain. The requested 2-acre section also has some small areas of floodplain within. It is near the Wake Crossroads Activity Center, should also be noted. The conditions that you saw last month, the applicant will prohibit the apartment building type. There is a number of non-residential uses that will also be prohibited. These items came about largely as the applicant's engagement with the community in the neighborhood meetings. Also limiting the hours of operation, prohibiting drive-throughs, and there's also additional easement dedication that has been provided as a condition. New conditions since you last heard this case on May 10th. The applicant has agreed, offered a condition to locate any vehicle parking for any commercial building that's developed on the site shall be located behind the building. And also the applicant will provide additional evergreen shrubs to be planted behind the road right-of-way along the parcel's frontage of Mitchell Mill. And those are the new conditions proposed since you last saw this case. Quickly, just summarizing the existing versus the proposed zoning, you see the difference in entitlements here. And our analyses. The request is inconsistent with the future land use map, which designates this area for moderate scale residential. Again, no urban form guidance specifically, but it is close to this Wake Crossroads Mixed Use Center. It is consistent overall with the comprehensive plan. Consistent policies noted here, and there are no inconsistent policies with this case. Your deadline is July 9th. There is one additional Planning Commission meeting prior to that time. That concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Belk. Next, we'll go to questions and comments from commissioners. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Seeing none, I'd like to entertain a motion. Go ahead.
I'd like to move to approve rezoning case Z6621 and to adopt the proposed consistency statement contained in the agenda materials dated June 14th, 2022.
Thank you, Commissioner Miller. And do we have a second?
Second.
Commissioner Miller has offered a motion to approve Z6621. Commissioner Dautel has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, by show of hands, those in favor? Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the next item, which is Z122, which is Wilmington Street and Stronach Alley at the northwest corner of the intersection of Wilmington Street and Lenore Street. Without objection, Commissioner Raines is recused from this item. Okay. We'll start with a brief staff update.
Excuse me if you'll give me a moment. Here. No. Apologize for that. So you saw this case at your last meeting, Z-1-22, on the north side of Lenore Street. And so this is a request for downtown mixed use with a 20-story height, shopfront frontage and conditions. The surrounding area is kind of a transition from the downtown, center of downtown towards the East Raleigh neighborhood. And there are multiple historic resources in the area. Here you can kind of see that transition. And so since you last saw this case, condition has been added and a couple of conditions have been modified. So condition number 5, the distance from Stronach Alley has been increased from 10 feet to 40 feet, as well as for condition 6, so that same increase from 10 feet to 40 feet. And so basically what that's communicating is that the trade-off for the developer would be greater if they attempted to avoid providing the pedestrian entrance and the particular building facade materials that are required by those conditions. They would have to move the building facade pretty far from Stronach Alley and give up a fairly large amount of development area within the site. And the applicant has communicated to me that one of the interests in putting a maximum distance for these conditions to apply is if there is interim development that is closer to Lenore Street, that would enable that to not have to respond to these conditions, which is likely also not desirable because it wouldn't actually serve the intended goal of activating Stronach Alley and providing reflecting historic congruity along Stronach Alley. And then the final condition has been added that's brand new, number 7, which would be to prohibit loading docks on facing Stronach Alley. One thing that was requested by the Historic Development Commission, which you don't see here, is an archaeological survey. The applicant has declined to offer a condition to require that or to make the site available for that purpose. So this area, of course, is very walkable, has good transit service, multimodal transportation, a mix of land uses. This rezoning would allow greater development on the site, which is consistent with a number of policies in the comprehensive plan, including the future land use map, both in terms of allowed uses and height. The shopfront frontage is supported by the urban form guidance for the site. I have details about the historic resources. We talked about those at your last meeting, so I won't spend too much time on that. But notably Stronach's Alley and the Pope House, and there is a zoning condition to prohibit pile driving within a certain distance of the Pope House, which you can see here. So with the changes to the two conditions related to Stronach's Alley and the addition of a new condition, that has moved some of the historic preservation policies from inconsistent to consistent, and the case's overall evaluation with the comprehensive plan to consistent, which does include the consistency with future land use map and urban form map, which have remained throughout the case. So you can see the breakdown of those policies. So still a few policies related to the transition in height between the core of downtown and the East Raleigh neighborhood, or the Prince Hall Historic District on the east side, and also the lack of archaeological survey. And here you can see, for reference, if you'd like, the recommendation of the Historic Development Commission and which items that they would have liked to see included with this request. And so your deadline is July the 23rd.
Thank you, Mr. Anagnost. Next, we'll move for questions and comments from commissioners. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Go ahead, Commissioner Bennett.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the applicant why the archaeological survey was declined.
Good morning, Commissioner Bennett, Mac Paul, here on behalf of Title. You had, several things that you'd asked, including the loading and outreach, and then the archaeological survey. I'd say three things about the archaeological survey. One, and I may have mentioned this last time, the one time we have done an archaeological survey was across Lenore on a site that was in the Historic Overlay District where there were two existing historical structures that were going to be removed. That was done recently. The survey did some ground penetrating radar and just, look, it wasn't clear exactly what the outcome of that survey was, but it was performed in that situation. Here we have a paved parking lot outside the Historic Overlay District. We looked at the report. It wasn't clear what the outcome of doing that sort of radar penetration. It is entering the brownfields program. There was a gas station, dry cleaning, so there's going to need to be remediation, removal of the soil because of the brownfields program. And thirdly, lastly, in communicating broadly with the community and meeting with the Pope House, I think there's interest in doing some other things. I mean, clearly, and we have folks here, interest in the history of the area, preserving that, and there were some really interesting ideas that were raised about how to do that, and so we want to continue those conversations, and the applicant is interested in supporting some of those other efforts, maybe with signage or direct, working with the Pope House.
Thank you. And thank you for meeting with the community. I appreciate that.
Any additional questions on this item?
I had a quick question because I missed the last time we met on this case. I just wanted to see if two of the historical neighbors from the community, Tupper Memorial Baptist Church and Shaw University, if they had a chance to voice their opinion or speak in opposition or in favor of this.
I can say that the real estate director for Shaw University has sent an email to, I believe, to you and to staff indicating that Shaw University is in support of this request. I can't speak for Tupper Memorial.
Yes, sir. Come forward.
Hi, I'm Kevin Sullivan. I'm with Shaw University for real estate. I live at 1209 Palace Garden Way, and Shaw is very much in support of this. Shaw needs to recruit and retain students, and right now we love McDonald's, but that's all we have near us, and so bringing some retail development and some life and energy to that part next to Shaw's campus is vital to Shaw, and continuing to be able to recruit and retain students, develop some entertainment, a place to get a cup of coffee, really to take what really is right now a dead space, empty, devoid of of people and bring life to it, and energy and density would do a world of help to Shaw. Thank you.
If we'd like to open up for public comment on this particular item, because I see we have a gentleman waiting, we have to do so by 2/3 vote. So a motion to approve hearing public comment. Do I have a second? Okay. And those in favor? Okay. All right. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, what he said. I'm Wallace Green. I'm with Trademark Properties. I represent Tupper Memorial Baptist Church. And we've seen the development of this block as an important bridge to the 500 block, particularly South Blunt Street. So we fully support the application.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Gaston Williams. In this capacity, I'm the chairman of the RHDC. Just to amplify one thing about the archaeological study that was proposed, that was mentioned by Commissioner Bennett. Part of the discussion that was extended discussion in the RHDC was that in communities like what surrounded Stronach's Alley back in the time, in the 40s and 50s, 60s, when there was no interest in doing archaeological preservation or studies back then. It was a disadvantaged community that didn't have a spokesman for these kinds of things. And that was one of our strong recommendations. It may not be practical, but it does very little if you dig it up and build a 20, 30, 40-story building and you don't record what was there. So that was our point in the RHCC. All the other suggestions, and we don't oppose it, all the other suggestions to RHDC seem to have been incorporated by the applicant. So that's it.
Thank you, sir. If there are no other comments, I'll move to any question. Thank you, Ms. Cawthon.
Good morning. Carmen Cawthon, just a community member. I have some papers that I'd like to, ma'am. I realize that part of why this touches me so much is because I spent several years living across the street from that said parking lot, and I grew up around that area because my father's drugstore was there, and I believe I mentioned that last time. The other thing is, in the land use history, there was discussion about downtown East and the redevelopment in 1980 that did include that area. And I do remember literally coming to the city council. I think that was the first time I came and spoke about proposals taking over the black neighborhoods. What I have shared with you this morning is the Redevelopment Commission from 1960, 1950, when the Hayti area, the 4th Ward area of Raleigh, was demolished deliberately, on purpose. And while this area was not next door to where that parking lot is today, it was 2 blocks away. I think even though this is 50 years later, it is important to recognize that too often in the city of Raleigh, in most cities, particularly in the South, the development of a city has come on the backs of the black community. And I think it's important that when the community has the opportunity to hear about what's happening, that the whole community has the opportunity, not just certain people who are considered in leadership. So I don't know if the church members have had a meeting and had their opportunity to speak. I don't know how Shaw students feel or their faculty feels. I just know how the leadership has said that they feel. And I know people in South Park are not hearing about this. It's just leadership. And I find that to happen at most of the planning things that are occurring. So I'm going to ask you as the Planning Commission to begin to look a little further and a little closer at the decisions that you're making, because perhaps you did not have this information in front of you. But this would This was part of a neighborhood. There was a hotel. There was a hospital across the street from that area. Those are things that, as Mr. Williams said, were not taken into account when they were torn down. So there was no survey. And most people don't know that history of Raleigh. But it's important to know that history of Raleigh. And it's important to know especially how many highways and streets in Raleigh were created tearing up black communities. I can't actually tell you I hate the idea of what's going here. I just hate the idea that in this instance, they won't even allow somebody else to do a survey. That's far-reaching. It's not like they're getting ready to break ground next week. I just ask you to begin to consider all of these things and the fact of whether or not something is in an opportunity zone and whether the opportunity zone original decision or the original purpose for it is being met, or if it's just, we're just making money. Thank you.
Thank you. As we've allowed members of the public to have additional comment, I would like to offer to the applicant if they have any additional comment as well.
I'm just going to say, I had a very lengthy conversation with Ms. Cawthorn and Ms. Rainey after the last meeting, and they had a number of good suggestions about community outreach, meeting with several of the former Central CAC chairs, and also spoke to the district councilor for this area about convening a broader district meeting, which he is working on, and obviously Shaw is coming forward with its plan and convening a number of meetings, and certainly understand the importance of that engagement, particularly given the history of this part of the city.
One quick question for you while you're up there. As the conditions are crafted right now, there's nothing that precludes a third party from approaching you to do an archaeological survey, is there?
Correct.
Okay, thank you, sir. Do we have any additional questions or comments? Commissioner Bennett?
So what if during construction something is unearthed? Would you stop and document what that is, or how would that work if if you're digging and you find something that might be something significant? If you're not doing the archaeological survey beforehand, what would happen in that case?
I don't think there would be anything particular that would happen. I will say that the owners of this site have looked closely at the history and the archaeological record from the Sanborn maps. So we know, where the buildings were situated based on those pretty detailed maps. Then you did have these other types of environmental contaminant uses that kind of followed them. So, that was part of the other archaeological survey that was just done. There was no requirement that they had to stop construction. So they basically were documenting what was there previously, and that was the end of the work.
Thank you.
Is there any additional question or comment for either staff or the applicant? Seeing none, I'd like to entertain a motion.
Thank you. I was going to say, given the brownfield nature of this site and the other historical maps for this particular site, I take Ms. Cawthon's comments to heart and certainly want to make sure that we're taking in the perspective of not just leadership, but of all of the history and the individuals that have that live in the area now and that have lived historically and the historical uses, especially as the city undergoes rapid change. For this project in particular, again, given the brownfield nature of the site and the previous historical maps on what was located particularly on this site, I will move to approve case Z, I believe it's 122, and to adopt the proposed consistency statement contained in the agenda materials.
And do we have a second? Commissioner Dautel offers a second. So, Commissioner Miller's offered a motion to approve. Commissioner Dautel's offered a second for Z122. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, those in favor? And those opposed? Nope, that motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the next item in old business, which is Z422 on West South Street. We will start with a brief staff update from Ira Mabel.
Yep. Good morning, Ira Mabel, Planning and Development. You have heard, excuse me. You have heard this case before. It is a request for 2 acres at South Street and South Saunders Street. Pardon me. With 3 different zoning districts on 3 separate parcels, and the conditions apply to 3 separate parcels. So we'll walk through it as best we can. And your deadline for action is June the 25th. So I believe you have to take action at this meeting. So just a refresher, the site is, roughly between downtown and to the east and Boylan Heights to the west, and you can see Dix Park there on the south side of Western Boulevard. So the first 2 conditions were what were on the case the last time you heard it, some prohibitions on uses and a limit in feet on height on the easternmost parcel, so the tallest 7-story district had a cap in feet. So the ones underlined in green are all new. So there's now a cap in feet on the middle parcel. This table here is not part of the condition. It's something I added in the slide to illustrate the difference between the UDO and what the conditions say. So under RX4, the UDO would allow 68 feet. And then the TOD bonus would allow higher. So this is at 60 feet. There is a new building setback for the middle and western parcels, and a step back for the building in the middle. And I have a illustration of this on the next slide. There is some specific, number 6, some specific landscaping for 2 of the parcels, and then some prohibition of materials for primary building siding. So this is my sketch of roughly how those conditions would play with each other. So there's this landscaping requirement, the highlighted in green, those trees, which are described more thoroughly. There's a setback, which is the blue sort of stippled, and then a building step back. So I have drawn this as right up against the setback, but the way it's written, it would apply to the building. So if there is something else in between the blue area and the building, like a parking lot or whatever, it would apply to the 4th story. But and then I didn't draw it on the city's easement there, because we have an easement there. But the conditions are silent on the easement. It applies to the parcel. But so nothing really has changed with the consistency determination. So still consistent with the future land use map as it was last time, and with the urban form map as it was last time, and with the plan overall. And again, you must either make a recommendation or ask for a time extension today. Be happy to answer any questions. And yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mabel. Do we have any questions or comments from commissioners? No, I'd say a significant amount of work has been done on this one to address many of the concerns we heard. So seeing no questions, I'd like to entertain a motion.
I'll make the motion.
Okay.
I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated June 14, 2022, containing agenda materials, and to recommend approval of this zoning amendment, Z422.
Thank you, Commissioner Mann. And do we have a second? Okay. Commissioner Mann has offered a motion to approve Z422. Commissioner Raines has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, by show of hands, those in favor? And any opposed? No, that motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the next item in old business, which is Z522 on C-Mart, north of P Street between Capitol Boulevard and Halifax Street. Start with a brief update from staff.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Falk. So this is a request to rezone around 3 acres from downtown mixed use 7 stories with an urban general frontage to downtown mixed use 20 stories with zoning conditions. And your deadline for action is July 9th. This is an aerial view of the site. Currently contains a garden center and the Eugene C. Bagwell train station, which is on a historic preservation wait list. And you can see the rest of the commercial uses in the Seaboard Station area. Of course, we have the train tracks here and some industrial, residential, and commercial uses on the west side of that. There is the garden center and train station today. Since you last heard this case, there have been some changes to the zoning conditions specifically related to preservation, so I'll focus on those. So condition number 5 is the preservation condition. The underlined sections of these slides are what has changed since you last saw them. Adding to the evaluation condition for feasibility that it would be conducted by a licensed professional. C, they added if the owner determines that either 5A or B are feasible. I think that's really important. The city doesn't have any oversight in that decision-making process. It is solely upon the owner and developer to determine feasibility structurally or financially on the advisement of their certified professionals. A new piece to this condition is unless the building is relocated, that 1,000 square feet of materials will be reused and repurposed on future development. So that's new. And then another condition here saying that if during the either relocation or any of those other preservation options, that if it becomes infeasible during those actions, that the owner may elect to back out of those preservation exercises. So if a building is being moved and it crumbles or falls apart, this is some out for them. Condition number 6 used to be part of, nested in one of those other options. It's been pulled out. So regardless of what preservation option occurs, 3D imaging and documentation will be conducted of the existing structure. So that's no longer part of another option. That will happen in any outcome. So those are the changes to conditions, of course. Higher walk, bike, and transit score, as this is in the city's downtown, with existing transit and planned transit improvements in the future. High job proximity, low transportation costs. Again, this is in a walkable mixed-use area near one of our region's employment centers. So affordability analysis, adding housing supply by increasing building height. All housing types are permitted, and again, within walking distance of transit. It does include the Eugene C. Bagwell train station that we talked about. The future land use map identifies the site in the central business district, so consistent with the downtown mixed-use zoning district that's requested. Inconsistent with urban form because there's not an urban frontage, but the site's narrow geometry, as you can see here, leaves little space for a parking lot between the building and any public space. So consistent with the plan overall. For those reasons, here are your consistent policies. Inconsistent with the frontage policy, your deadline for action is July 9th. I know the applicants are here and can probably speak a little more deliberately about the changes to preservation zoning conditions, but I can also answer questions if you have them.
Thank you, Mr. Clem. I imagine there may be some questions and comments from commissioners related to the new conditions. Are there any questions or comments? I'd say a significant amount of work has been done, and we're not able to function as a de facto Raleigh Historic Development Commission here. So in the function of what we're able to do here with conditions, I found this satisfactory, but I'll entertain a motion from one of my fellow commissioners.
Thank you. And I just wanted to make one additional comment too. Since I was the one that was sort of not letting go of this bone at the last meeting, we all come to these positions with our own perspectives, and as a contract lawyer, I very much wanted to see the language reflect something, even though the intent I certainly appreciated, and the the integrity and of the development team is incredibly strong, and they have a ton of goodwill and have done excellent projects preserving the historical nature of various sites around downtown. So I wanted to recognize that. So thank you for the additional work that has been accomplished here and for the additional language to really document that intent. So with that, I agree with Chair Fox that I do support this case and the new project.
We have two comments that are waiting to be made from the public.
Okay. We would have to take a vote of a 2/3 majority if we'd like to hear additional public comment on this item. I'd ask the public that their comments not be duplicative of anything that they may have said previously. Would anyone like to make a motion to hear additional public comment?
So moved.
Okay. And do we have a second? Second? Okay. And those in favor? Okay. All right. So please come down. We'll have a time start, allow you to make additional public comment, and then we can hear from the applicant team as well.
Madam Chair, can you let us know how much time you'd like to provide?
Let's do 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My placard, I'm Ruth Little. I live at 2312 Bedford Avenue, Raleigh. I'm one of the signers of this report on the commission for the commission that was distributed last month. I have actually in absentia a comment to read from Matthew Brown, who's one of the most eloquent advocates for the preservation of the Bagwell Station. Unfortunately, he's out of the country, but here is what he wanted me to present. At its May meeting, the Planning Commission deferred this case. Several members of the commission gave their reason for not approving the rezoning at that meeting. They wanted to see the demolition option conditioned on some determination that it is not feasible to save the building. The developer has not given these Planning Commission members what they specifically asked for. That is a slap in the face at the commission. The application should be denied unless the developer adds this condition. And now I have a statement of my own. I made a statement last month, but this is different information. We have a leadership failure now in Raleigh. The mayor and city council and city planners should be insisting that to be a great city, we save our infrastructure memorials, like Seaboard Station. But because the Logan family refused to allow the station to be landmarked, everyone is abdicating their responsibility. You, the Planning Commission, can save the day, use the property, help Turnbridge developers use the property to gain their development goals without sacrificing our heritage. This station is an irreplaceable cultural marker for Raleigh's mid-20th century history and its civil rights history during the mid-20th century. As a young state government employee in the 1970s, it was my link to the world. I stood on the track waiting to board the Silver Star to travel to Washington, D.C., and as a newlywed on our honeymoon trip to New England. The Seaboard is a civil rights icon. It has separate waiting rooms in this public train depot built 1 year into World War II so that white passengers didn't have to mingle with black passengers while waiting for the train. All the soldiers riding the train during the remaining 3 years of the war and their families, they were separated like cattle in this Jim Crow southern city of Raleigh. This beautiful classical revival Jim Crow depot is in perfect condition. It's an iconic, totally serviceable architectural monument waiting to serve double duty to tell the story of Raleigh's segregation history while performing a totally new 21st century function. Let creative architects and engineers use steel beams to add a parking deck to Seaboard Station's airspace. Let Seaboard be the first level retail space that a parking deck needs to keep from being an off-putting black hole in the center of what should be a vibrant mixed-use neighborhood. Leave the train shed as a public open plaza with outdoor seating and restaurants. All over the world, historic buildings are preserved in place with modern buildings perched on steel stilts above them. You are entrusted as the Planning Commission with the mandate to do the right thing for Raleigh's evolution as a great southern city. Let the engineers and architects use their creativity to leave Seaboard in place and to build car ramps to access a parking deck on top of this capital city's historic public amenity. This is how Raleigh should grow. We have a chance with Seaboard Station to get it right. Thank you.
Just a brief comment. I'm here as an individual and also one of the group of individuals that made this memo available to you through personal delivery, I think, and I appreciate your taking the time to read it. Our position remains unchanged. We support the project, but Condition 5C is the Death Star for Seaboard Station. It's even worse than that in one way. Last session, one or more of you raised an issue about what were the triggers. And this set of conditions, place the triggers without a safety switch in the hands of the applicant. There's very little required of them to do in order to choose option 5C. Virtually nothing. So that's our pitch and argument that's new based on the new conditions. We hope you consider the value of the station to the history of Raleigh.
Thank you, I appreciate that. If there's no one else here to make comment, I'd like to offer the applicant some time to speak.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have it here. You want that one? No, I'll just go to the conditions.
Okay. Good morning, Jamie Schwadler at 301 Fayetteville Street with Parker Poe here on behalf of the applicant. We couldn't find the presentation, but I think I can make my comments brief as we had a very lengthy discussion at the last hearing. And I would like to just emphasize what we heard at that hearing and what we changed in direct result. The conditions can be summarized in a group of four. First was changing the evaluation, not just for feasibility, but specifically to study the feasibility of 5A and 5B by a licensed professional. And then beyond that, if the owner determines that neither a 5A or 5B are feasible, then we move on to 5C. This is the trigger that we heard the commission ask for. This is the trigger that we worked very hard as a team to overcome some significant discomfort to provide. And we would submit that the integrity, we appreciate the comments about the integrity of the development team. This team, as you know, has done other historic preservation options in every other project that it's developed, both here in Raleigh and in the city of Durham, that do have historic preservations in place. Of course, this building and this site do not have those conditions in place, and so we've worked very hard. In fact, taking into consideration comments like Ms. Little's throughout the 6-month community engagement process to develop that Condition 5. Condition 5 is in place because of that community engagement that we did before we got here, and all the changes we've made since are in direct relation to what we heard at this commission. So in addition to adding that trigger, Commissioner Lampman also asked us if the trigger wasn't possible, could we beef up 5C to make that have a little more oomph in terms of preservation. We did that by adding the C3, unless the building is relocated, a minimum of 1,000 square feet of existing existing building materials shall be preserved or repurposed on site. That condition mimics the RUSBUS preservation commitment that was adopted by the prior council for a 40-story zoning in downtown. So again, it exceeds the precedent before you for buildings that were actually protected and deemed historic contributing structures. And even though it's not here on the screen, we made clear that it would include or could include things like the columns, the sign, things that are kind of nostalgic and easily recognizable. So it's clear that when we bring this option forward, whichever of these options that we take to site plan, that we will be able to reincorporate some of those issues. And again, defining the building as including those iconic entryways that were mentioned by Ms. Little. The final change was that we'd heard through this community engagement that the documentation was significant and something that they wanted to see regardless of which option was examined. And we did kind of think about what happens if we pursue one option and something happens to the building. So this allows us to preserve this no matter what, to have the documentation and displays on site so that no matter which of the three options are selected, the public can have that integrity that's in place. And again, I would submit to you what you see here in the preservation of the canopies in 5C is more than what many actually regulated historic buildings have throughout the city. And that's significant because those do not exist today in the way that the building has come to you. So we appreciate the time to work with the commission and respond to those requests and submit that this is a holistic way to look at providing new housing and preserve something that has no protections today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schwedler. I'll also acknowledge, I believe the RHDC does have the legislative authority to landmark something over and above the wishes of an owner, and so I'm struck that they hadn't done that previously, and I find these conditions to be above and beyond for a building that is not landmarked. So, do we have any additional questions or comments, Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you. Just a couple things. First, at the last meeting, I said that I felt like we were being given an ultimatum, and I just want to clarify that I feel like the situation is presenting us with an ultimatum. I don't feel like the applicant is giving us an ultimatum. I just want to say that. I already talked to Ms. Schwedler, but I said it publicly, so I wanted to clarify publicly that I didn't feel like the applicant was giving us an ultimatum. I feel like the situation of if we approve the rezoning, then we have these preservation conditions, and if we don't, the building isn't protected at all. The situation felt like an ultimatum, so I wanted to say that first. And second, I do appreciate the effort that the applicant has put into revising the conditions. I understand that the language still may not be exactly what the community is asking for, but what I've struggled with is RHDC, the previous owner, neither one has moved to protect this building, and I don't understand why. We all recognize the historic significance of it, but as it stands today, it's not protected at all. And so I feel like the applicant has gone above and beyond what they would need to do for a building that isn't protected. Unfortunately, that's just the reality. It's not protected, and it seems like we have conditions here that we don't even see sometimes for buildings that are protected. So one of the things I say is I try to be consistent and I try to be fair, and it doesn't seem fair to hold this applicant to a standard for a resource that's not protected that we wouldn't hold an applicant to for a resource that is protected. So for those reasons, I'm going to support the rezoning.
Thank you for your comments. Did I see your hand? Go ahead.
Yes, and I wanted to add as well, again, being the person that was very much stuck on wanting to have a trigger for 5C at this last meeting, And again, coming at it from the perspective of a contract lawyer, wanting to make sure that language was correct. And I know that there is going to be concern from the general public that maybe this is not robust enough. However, and I can ask our deputy city attorney as well his thoughts, but looking at the fact that they added that the feasibility has to be determined by a licensed professional, and that the owner, yes, the owner then determines whether it's feasible, but it's going to be based on a study from a licensed professional, and they still put in a reasonable, it has to be determined that it's reasonably feasible. So with that reasonability qualifier, this creates, if they determined that they needed to, that it was not feasible, that this, I suspect, might be subject to litigation, and that these are actually real legally enforceable triggers that are as meaningful as I can creatively think of as an attorney trying to include here. So there are real triggers here, but that's my late. Well, I'm an attorney, but I will defer to the deputy city attorney. But that's what got me over the hump, is that this trigger does have meaningful teeth. But I might ask the deputy city attorney if he might weigh in as well on how this language was created, or if he looked at it.
Yes, we looked at it, and they are real triggers. Granted, the triggers are under their control, but they lay out the process that they're going to go through. And that places, they're basically proposing a condition that puts their integrity on the line, so to speak. And so, but it is, it's totally in their control. If those same triggers were placed for the city to decide, they would be subjective, and the city would have to go into a quasi-judicial arena of some sort to evaluate the zoning conditions. And so they don't have to do that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So with the, not reasonability, but the reasonableness trigger here, again, that's what causes me to be more comfortable with this project and to support it.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I'd like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Miller?
I'll move to approve rezoning case, my computer's frozen, Z522, and to adopt the proposed consistency statement contained in the agenda materials dated June 14th, 2022.
Thank you. And do we have a second?
Second.
Commissioner Mann? Commissioner Miller has offered a motion to approve C522, and Commissioner Mann has offered a second. Do we have any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, by show of hands, those in favor? Any opposed? Okay, thank you. That motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the new business portion of the agenda, item F.1, which is rezoning Z6221. These are items which we have not heard on a previous agenda, so we will have a full staff presentation, an applicant presentation, and comment from the public. We'll start off with Mr. Belk.
Good morning again. This is Z6221, 3 parcels, 1325, 35, and 41 Chester. The request would retain the underlying zoning, however, it would remove the Oberlin Village Neighborhood Conservation Overlay District designation. This proposal, this case is up for your deadline soon on June the 25th. The zoning in the area, as you see, is predominantly residential, mostly R6 to the north and east. There is some R10 and RX zoning west and south of the site, as well as some office mixed use. An aerial view showing the prevalence of the low-scale residential in this area. Closer view showing the parcels that are separated by a single parcel that is presently developed. Some streetscape perspectives here Chester Road looking north. Subject site would be to your left. And again, a view on Chester looking south. Additional streetscape views. This one, the one on the upper right, shows the office building that is across from the site, and scenes of existing residential within the area. The applicant has offered a single condition to provide an opaque fence or wall of at least 6 feet. This would be installed along the southern site boundary and part of the western site boundary, and they have designated in the proposal exactly which properties would be affected there. Some comparisons. I should note that this proposal, since it was originally submitted, we have had the Missing Middle 2.0 text changes adopted. So we did re-perform our Envision Tomorrow analysis. The existing zoning, you see the yield of potentially 9 plus townhomes and 14 attached units. The changes as a result of Missing Middle 2.0 now would yield 15 townhomes and 22 attached homes. Setbacks do not change. The proposal scores well on our transportation and energy analysis. As you see, all of the indicators are positive. Although the site is along a transit emphasis corridor, at present the nearest bus stop is more than a quarter mile away. However, Oberlin Road is served by Go Raleigh Route 16. It also scores well in the affordability analysis. However, it does not include any subsidized units, and I mentioned that it is not exactly within walking distance of transit at the present time. I think that's 0.33 miles. However, as a result of the recent comprehensive plan amendment, CP 1521, this area is now within a frequent transit area, so it's an area that's designated for additional investments in transit going forward and more frequent transit service. Demographics and land use history. In the staff report, I believe this proposal, there is information regarding the location of the Oberlin Village neighborhood district and how that larger area had been affected by urban renewal. That information is reflected in your staff report. The zoning, the requested R6 zoning, which of course has not changed the underlying zoning, that is consistent with moderate scale residential. I need to point out, unfortunately in the staff report, there were a couple of errors there on page 2 and 10. The wrong box was checked, just to clarify and avoid any further confusion on that. This proposal is consistent with the future land use map. However, there are a number of key policies regarding moderate scale residential pertaining to building scale and massing that are inconsistent, and I'll talk about those in a moment. As I mentioned, the proposal is also consistent with the urban form map. It isn't reflected here, but this entire area that you see is within the frequent transit area as a result of the recent comprehensive plan amendment. Again, it is consistent with the flume for moderate density residential. It is consistent with the urban form map as being within a frequent transit area. A number of consistent policies here, as you see, including capitalizing on transit access. It's in an area where future further investments in transit infrastructure are anticipated. Certainly adds to the housing supply, and the form would be consistent with our policy on greenhouse gas reductions. The inconsistent policies that I noted really have to do with the scale and massing. The comprehensive plan is specific in talking about how to integrate a new housing under our missing middle policies and integrating that within existing low-scale residential neighborhoods. These properties are deemed inconsistent because the applicant did not address specifically those issues. And again, your deadline for action is pending on June the 25th. And that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Belk. Next, we'll move on to the applicant and those in support. They have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Mac Paul, here on behalf of the owner, George Yelverton. I got involved fairly recent and have had the opportunity to meet and talk to Rob Salibi, who is here this morning on behalf of a number of neighbors, and that you may have heard from some of the other neighbors. So I'm going to be pretty brief. Primarily, this case is just about removing the NCOD on these properties. The one property in between has been developed as a leasing office for apartment development behind it. You recently dealt with this NCOD across Oberlin near Academy or Annapolis, where the NCOD was removed. I know there have been some concerns about incremental dealing with NCODs, even though we understand as a policy matter they may not serve the purpose today in terms of constraining housing supply when they were put in place maybe 30 years ago. This is, I want to emphasize, this is not the Oberlin Village Historic Overlay District. This is a different overlay district. It's an NCOD on the other side of Wade Avenue. Basically what I told Mr. Salibi, I wanted to have this conversation this morning, get your feedback, see what how the staff report shook out just with the only change being made. Essentially, the NCOD limits it to 2 stories. So with R6 zoning, you can build up to 45 feet. So that's really the difference here. You've done a lot of work recently on the missing middle and dealing with R6, which is the predominant zoning district for most of low-density neighborhoods throughout the city of Raleigh. So I'm interested in your thoughts in terms of how would you need to further refine or constrain or to condition a low-density zoning district like R6, and I've told Mr. Salibi if there's specific things at this location that are of concern that we need to deal with, we're open to continuing those discussions. So essentially that's what we're asking for, keeping it R6 and letting the greater flexibility recently adopted under the missing middle control.
Thank you. And are there members of the public here to speak on this item?
My name's Robin Salibi. I've been appointed the neighborhood spokesperson in relation to this zoning case. I'd first like to thank each and every planning commission member for your dedication and service to our great city. My family and I have been lifelong residents of this neighborhood dating back to the 1950s. We've witnessed a lot of the changes and growth Raleigh has embraced over the years. I'm an avid supporter of growth and development in our city. I'm a supporter of higher density development and buildings as tall as we can build them in areas where that growth, height, and density is appropriate. However, a low density, predominantly single family neighborhood is not one of those areas.
Excuse me, Mr. Salibi, could you move the mic closer?
Yes,
I
ma'am.
can't hear you.
Is that better? In the pre-neighborhood meeting, there was over 130 participants voicing overwhelming opposition to Mr. Yelverton's rezoning case. Since then, those numbers in opposition have continued to grow. There are many points I'd like to point out to highlight in regards to the negative effects created by the zoning case. The property owner seeking to remove the NCOD on the property, which falls right across the street and what we believe is continuous with the Oberlin Village overlay, which you all know restricts height to 28.7 feet. Obviously, removing that overlay allows the property owner to build up to 45 feet and almost quadruple the structure size to be built on the parcels from a current maximum of 22,000 square feet to over 83,000 square feet. These parcels are located on the interior of our neighborhood. They border single-family residences and low-density residential homes, as both Mr. Belk and Mac highlighted. I've had numerous conversations with Mac Paul. I'm very appreciative of how engaged and understanding he's been throughout this process. Unfortunately, Mac is just a representation, and without the nod from the property owner, he is not able to address the neighborhood's concerns. While we've had very good conversations and communication, it should be noted not one concern or issue brought forth by the neighborhood has been addressed, nor any condition has been added. The zoning request, as Mr. Belk highlighted, has many City of Raleigh policy inconsistencies. Many of those relate to the request lacking conditions that would ensure future development is in keeping with the existing building form of the area, as well as to protect the neighborhood's character. There's also infill compatibility inconsistencies as a result of there being no conditions to safeguard against existing surrounding neighborhood, such as building type, height, setbacks, and other design elements. Our neighborhood has been incredibly reasonable in coming up with one main condition that will satisfy a majority of our concerns. That condition is for the building type to restrict units from being separated by a horizontal party wall, meaning no stacked dwelling units. This would allow the property owner to remove the North Carolina COD and gain an extra 17 feet of building height, but would meet the neighborhood's condition of traditional non-stackable row townhomes on the parcels. Obviously, this would allow for an increased density, but also provide an appropriate transition into the predominantly single-family neighborhood. Additionally, I'd like to reference, and Mac touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to go into a little more detail of case Z6920 involving 1302 Oberlin Road, which did have the Oberlin Village overlay. That's located on an exterior road at the edge of where our neighborhood starts, at the corner of Oberlin Road and Annapolis Drive. 1302 Oberlin was designated OX3 in the 2030 comp plan, obviously meaning it was much more fitting for higher density than the parcels in this zoning case. However, the property owner of that case, Johnny Chappell, heard and agreed with the neighborhood's concerns. He added a non-stackable row townhome condition, added a unit cap, and also respected the Oberlin Village overlay with a condition limiting building height along Oberlin Road to 28.7 feet. And I have to applaud Johnny for his efforts during that process. There are many purposes in creating the Oberlin Village overlay. I believe one of those reasons was to protect and help repair the harm and displacement forced upon Black, Indigenous, and people of color community as a result of the segregationist history that presided over the Oberlin Village area. The current multifamily residences on the parcels proposed in this zoning case are some of the few remaining low-income and affordable housing options in our neighborhood. In fact, have been home to many Black, Indigenous, and people of color over the years. Removing this overlay to allow for a high-end market rate development in place of the current affordable housing options that lie there today goes directly against one of the very reasons the Oberlin Village overlay was established. It seems the property owner in this case is choosing his wealth over respecting the establishment of the overlay and the communities that it serves. Do we see Mr. Yelverton adding any affordable housing options, conditions to his request? Absolutely not. He even stated in our neighborhood meeting his reason for rezoning was for estate purposes. Entities tied to Mr. Yelverton recently sold a large tract of land in our neighborhood for $16.75 million, which was home to over 100 single-story cottage apartment homes that housed hundreds, if not thousands, of low-income and BIPOC families over the years. These were demolished and replaced with high-end market-rate apartment development that will have over 500 beds that's plagued our neighborhood and displaced countless of less fortunate families from our community. To put Mr. Yelverton's wealth and estate planning above the interests of our neighborhood and community is very unsettling for us. We stand united in our opposition. Our request would be for Mr. Yelverton to do the right thing and we believe withdraw his case. However, if he continues to push forward, we respectfully ask that our main condition of non-stackable townhome condition be added. As Mr. Belk stated earlier, the staff report contained many errors, and we have not had adequate time to fully understand some of the discrepancies in information it entails. Additionally, we'd like an opportunity to work with MAC and have conditions added, and beg this commission to please postpone any vote today to give us time to address those concerns. Thank you.
Are there any additional members of the public here to speak? Please go ahead.
My name is Steve Sartorio. I live on Churchill Road. I'm a recently retired attorney, so I'm a reformed attorney. I used to be a litigator, so I hope not to be argumentative about this, but I think what Mr. Belk failed primarily to show to you in his presentation, especially the photographs he showed, was how this area, this part of Chester, is a gateway to low density residential R4 neighborhoods, specifically as Chester leads down to Lewis Circle, as you turn left onto Churchill Road, as you go on the majority of Lion Street. Those are all R4 low density residential homes. And this development, as he's proposing, is totally out of character with that neighborhood. So I would suggest to you that the overlay district, which I think was first enacted back in the 1980s, the purpose of that overlay district is still valid today. It is a gateway to the rest of that low density residential neighborhood. And I think that was readopted with the UDO, I believe, in 2016, and I don't believe there's any reason to change that today. Now, having said that, I understand that life is about compromise, and I think that, as I understand it, the compromise that has been discussed by Mr. Salibi and Mr. Belk, Mr. Paul, would help preserve the character of that gateway. And so I would suggest that those conversations would be fruitful, and that the Planning Commission should take consideration of those. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There's one more member of the public. Please go ahead. Just want to acknowledge we're at a minute.
Yep, very quick. My name's Aaron Isbell. I'm not a lawyer. I live in the neighborhood. My father, I went to NC State from Gastonia, North Carolina. And as I've lived in Raleigh, what's gotten me excited about living here is all the growth in the community that I live in. One of the things that you might not recognize is that I recently moved to the neighborhood. I built a house that was consistent with the character of the neighborhood. I didn't have to do that, but I met Rob. I met many of the other neighbors that were a joy to be around. So when my wife and I had the privilege to build a home, we wanted to be consistent. I think the word that keeps coming up today is inconsistent. If I use my skill set, that, what I do in my world is I like to get people excited like a hype man. I've noticed that no one up here is smiling today. So what I would like you to think about is, how can we all have a win? How can we all be excited? I think that the neighborhood, especially with what Rob said and what Steve said, is that we just want there to be, townhouses if it moves forward. I could be excited about townhouses. I think it would protect and help, be more consistent with the character of the neighborhood. If it's stacked condos, et cetera, then it's absolutely inconsistent. No one's excited and no one's happy and no one has a smile on their face. So
thank you, sir. Next, we'll move on to questions and comments from commissioners. I'll start out with a question to the applicant. Has the applicant considered a restriction to non-stackable units or townhouse style?
Yes, and I've told Mr. Salibi, we're open to continuing that discussion. I really would like, again, we kind of wanted to see where we came out on the staff report and get feedback, particularly in light of a lot of the broader policy that the city's been dealing with residential development, and what's appropriate at this location.
Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you. At the last meeting, Travis, I think you answered a question for me, but I can't quite remember what you said, so I'll ask again. The missing middle text change, I believe, had some sort of provision that if there is a conflict with an NCOD, the NCOD governs. But I believe you were explaining that that refers to a specific something, and I couldn't remember what that specific something was.
Thanks for the question, and I hope I provide the same answer I did last time. And I could go back and look at the specific wording in the UDO. I think that's a pretty general clause that's placed in the code, because oftentimes there are regulations that might not completely align with each other, and in the instance of conflict, it's helpful for staff to see which prevails, right? So having language in the code that says either this section prevails or that section prevails is pretty common. And I know that having language that states that an NCOD regulation would essentially trump any other regulations is common in the code. But we can confirm that for you.
Go ahead if you had a follow-up. I also wanted to note, too, I think your answer might have covered when it's specific to an actual development plan versus a rezoning.
Ask that again.
The NCOD trumping comment, you framed that in the sense of a development plan coming forward versus a staff review for a rezoning.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's true. I jumped right over that. So that language would be reviewed when a development plan has been submitted, not during a rezoning.
Okay. Okay. So the struggle that I'm having, and I think we're probably going to see this a lot now with the various text changes that have happened, when the frequent transit areas and the missing middle housing and some of these other changes come up against NCODs. I'm not oblivious to some of the unintended, maybe intended consequences of NCODs that we may be trying to mitigate and move past. But my struggle is that these NCODs are in place and people have bought housing and spent lots and lots of money with this understanding that there's going to be this type of development in this neighborhood. And then maybe the thinking has shifted that, oh, maybe we're getting some consequences from these NCODs that we don't want, and we're dealing with it in a piecemeal fashion through these rezonings. So we take a parcel out, we take a parcel out. And my feeling is if there's a general thought that we want to have some broader policy to deal with the unintended consequences of NCODs, we need to do that like we did in missing middle housing or some of these other things, rather than coming to the Planning Commission to deal with it parcel by parcel. Because it makes me uncomfortable, even if I support the broader goals of the city, it makes me uncomfortable to say, sure, we can pull these parcels out of this NCOD, and then another applicant comes and I say, no, we can't. What's the trigger? How do we distinguish when it's okay and when it's not okay? And once we've said it's okay, so if we say it's okay today for this one, what happens if an applicant comes with another parcel in this neighborhood and then we say no? I just struggle with being inconsistent without having some sort of logical, checkbox to say, okay, well, we can take this one out because of X, Y, Z, but no, let's not do it here. I just think there's a broader policy implication that we're trying to address here that might be better addressed in a broader sense than through these individual rezonings. I feel like the Planning Commission is being asked to address something that we may not have the authority, the responsibility to do as a Planning Commission.
I'll note that I believe at a recent city council meeting, one of the city council members acknowledged basically what you're saying. There's a broader conversation about NCODs. So I think our job here, each case is individual and unique unless it's the same parcel coming through over and over again. So each one we look at, evaluate it based on its location within a neighborhood. Is it on an internal street or an external street? Does it connect with other parcels? And basically context-sensitive things. And I think we're okay to do that, but I agree, that was my comment as well, is when these cases addressing NCODs are consistently coming through, there's a larger and broader
And in response to the context-sensitive point you made, I totally agree that each one is unique in that sense. But when there's this protection that's put in place that has gone through a community engagement process and the community worked with the city to put this in place, it just feels like to then come through with the rezoning and say, we're going to pull it out. I don't, what's the purpose? If I'm spending 2 years, some of these plans take, 2 years to put in place, and I'm working with the city in good faith, and I feel like, okay, I'm in this neighborhood, it's going to be like this until we do another plan maybe, until an applicant comes and wants to build whatever and pull the parcels out. I don't like the precedent that it sets. I'm fine with evaluating each case as unique and context sensitive unless there has been some broad protection put in place. And I just think that needs to be dealt with first before it comes to us to deal with it in this way, because I think we end up with equity and fairness and why'd you do it for this neighborhood but you didn't do it for this neighborhood. And I just don't think that's, me as an individual, me as an urban planner, absolutely, I can talk about it, I can deal with it. Me as a planning commissioner, I don't think that's our job to do.
Your points are well taken. Commissioner Miller, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to thank the applicant and all of the members of the public who wrote in to us and who have engaged throughout this process. I know it can be very time-consuming. And congratulate Mr. Sartorio on his retirement from the law. As I'm looking at this, I'm dealing with a lot of the same issues. And as a planning commission, we're making decisions, but this is a legislative body, and so we're constantly weighing competing policy interests. And when NCODs come up, I feel like there's an inherent conflict between NCODs generally and meaningful city planning, because it can be problematic to provide effective city planning with to further the goals of city planning and adjust to the changing needs of the city when these NCODs are in place. However, so I have, if I were a council member talking about NCODs generally, that would be one thing that I think we're talking about. However, as a planning commissioner, once an NCOD actually exists, we also have the need for the government to be predictable and objectively consistent in its application of its laws and policies. So when the citizens go through the process of a 2-year, sometimes longer process of creating an NCOD, that needs to mean something. So when we have those and we're looking at these here, there are sometimes we find a parcel being removed from an NCOD when the NCOD itself has sort of outlived its useful life. We saw that some in the Boylan Heights area when almost all of the properties have been turned over to commercial uses. And so when I'm looking at these, in addition to figuring out context, being context sensitive and whether it's sort of on the outside of the parcel, I'm like inherently thinking about whether this NCOD has outlived its useful life. So I might be interested in learning more about the history of this NCOD and its initial purpose, intended purpose. However, inherently given the process of an NCOD, it means that a certain percentage of the neighbors want it. That's what the process is to create this. And given the generous outpouring of support from the neighbors, it's clear that the neighbors still want this. So in that case, I don't see how this has outlived its useful life. So in that case, the neighbors' interest in creating the NCOD in the first place are incredibly strong, and I'm glad to hear that the applicant is interested in talking with the neighbors and seeing what it would take to to further their goals, if this is removed from the NCOD at all. But on this case in particular, if you're looking for some signaling from the commission, I'm very interested in what, it seems like this NCOD has not outlived its useful life, and we're very interested in, I at least am very interested in what the neighbors want to see in this area.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. Commissioner Rains?
Thanks, Chair Fox. Just a question for the staff, Donald Belk. This is more of a technical question. One of the comments with policy LU 8.5, I guess the question is, if we were to ask the applicant to provide some conditions or limits on scale, massing, form, that sort of thing, what would that look like? What sort of language would we ask them to provide to align with community character?
Thank you. There are some other precedents, other zoning cases where this has been addressed through specifications regarding building materials, roof pitch, specifics on the building height, and other specific details of the form itself. I think the idea is, as I understand it from the comprehensive plan guidance, is to try to have, acknowledging that there's going to be, bigger buildings, different building types, multifamily, triplexes, et cetera, to have those designed in a way that they fit in and reflect the existing character of the neighborhood, particularly in these older neighborhoods. So it would be, some of those specifics could be described in conditions.
All right, thanks. I guess I would ask the applicant then to consider the townhome versus the stackable condition, and also adding some sort of language that would help support the character of the existing community, form and materials.
Vice Chairman, did you have a comment?
I was just going to add one small comment. I know this case is out of the HOD, the Oberlin Village Overlay District, but I would recommend to the applicant to also speak, I'm sorry if you can't hear me, to also speak with, in addition to the property owners, but to the Friends of Oberlin Village Historic Committee. So that would look good to us as far as having the neighborhood and the Oberlin Village folks in support of this case.
Well, circling back, it looks like our deadline for action is June 25th, and we've made some recommendations for some additional considerations and additional conversation with the neighborhood. So I'd like to recommend that we actually request additional time on this case. And I'm going to look to Mr. Crane for an indication of the amount of time we would need to address the break that we have as well.
So if you requested 90 days, that should give you a pretty ample window to address this request, realizing that you're not going to use, you don't have to use the full amount of time. So after the meeting on June 28th, the Planning Commission will go on break until the second week of August. So, a lot of the time, extra time will be eaten up by your vacation, quote unquote. So it's entirely possible that this case can come back and be discussed in an additional meeting in August.
Okay.
So 90 days gives you a good buffer.
Excellent. With that, I'd like to offer a motion to request a 90-day extension. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, Commissioner Rains. Show of hands, those in favor. Any opposed? Oh, that motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the next item under new business, which is text change to zoning conditions TCZ 9121. We will start with a staff presentation from Mr. Belk.
Good morning again. This is a text change to the existing zoning conditions that were approved in 2006 under the rezoning case Z4506. It is TCZ 9129, TCZ 9121, excuse me. This is a satellite annexation, and I'll describe that a little more going forward. The zoning in the area, it's R4, and there is a bit of CX3 to the south along Buffalo Road. The predominant zoning, I should add, is R30 Wake County, and then south of Buffalo Road, it would be the rural transition zoning from the town of Knightdale. Here's an image that kind of illustrates what I was trying to say. It's a satellite annexation, and it represents the easternmost extent of Raleigh's corporate limits at this point. And you can see the proximity to current Raleigh ETJ. The contiguous corporate limits are further to the west. And then the town of Knightdale's planning jurisdiction is on the south side of Buffalo Road, and also it has fairly close proximity to the corporate limits of Knightdale as well. The area is predominantly rural residential, still a lot of active agricultural activity in the area. I should note that the Hodges Mill Creek property is a city-owned property, future park site. The dedication of that property was part of the initial rezoning and annexation of this site. Just a couple of perspectives showing that rural and undeveloped nature of this area along Buffalo Road, and then at the other property interests at Robertson Grove Road. Number of conditions. Again, these are from the original Z4506 conditions. They have been revised. Some conditions have been removed. This condition number 1 specifies that the different recreational facilities that could be offered, it will include a clubhouse and at least 2 of the following facilities that you see listed. One change is it is increasing the maximum number of residential units to a cap of 1,000. The owner, if requested by the city, the owner will dedicate land of at least 2 acres for a future public safety or fire station. They will be preserving 20% of the property as open space, and that open space will largely serve as additional buffers between adjoining properties, and those specifics are given here. There was a condition to dedicate a greenway easement. However, that condition was deleted because it is replicated by existing code, which requires a 50-foot greenway easement dedication. Changes under this proposal, I mentioned it is lifting the cap or setting a cap for the maximum number of residential units. No changes to the setbacks. Because of its remote location comparative to other parts of Raleigh, it scored very low on our transportation and energy analysis. The site is entirely car dependent. It would increase the housing supply, however, and under the new missing middle text changes, a variety of housing types would be permitted, as well as smaller units. But it would also enable larger lots than the citywide average and is far from existing transit. Under our demographics and land use history analysis, the area has a higher percentage of minority populations and is slightly more linguistically isolated. It does have a higher population of people with less than a high school education than the citywide averages. However, the low-income population is less than the city average, and we identified no restrictive covenants or historical covenants that restricted racial groups. The R4 zoning, as requested, is consistent with the future land use map designation of low-scale residential. It is consistent also overall with the comprehensive plan. Note the consistent policies. I'll point out particularly LU 2.5, healthy communities, conditions that provide for recreational facilities, open space and new developments. They have pledged a 20% preservation of open space. It also would enable additional buffers that could protect local streams. Harris Branch is a first-order tributary of the Neuse River. And it would enable greenway-oriented development along the future Harris Creek Greenway. The one inconsistent policy that was noted, LE 3.1, this policy specifies that for zoning and annexing of lands outside of the city's existing corporate limits. Actually, it refers to special study areas. This area is part of the northern urban study area as shown on the future land use map. And the inconsistency noted is that this area, there has not been a special study performed for this area. So that is the one inconsistent policy of this proposal. Your deadline would be July 23rd. There is one upcoming meeting prior to that. There are no outstanding issues at this time. That concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Belk. Next, we'll move on to the applicant. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the Planning Commission. I'm Isbell Maddox, P.O. Box 946, Raleigh 27602. Here today with me is David Mason, VP Carolinas of Landever LLC, which is the contract purchaser of this property, and that's who I'm representing here today. This request is for a large parcel of approximately 289 acres. As Mr. Belk indicated, it was satellite annexed into the city in 2006. And rezoned at that time to R4 with these various conditions, which are still in place 16 years later. When 2008 hit and the unpleasantness that went with it, the proposed development at that time, which was for Rivertown, went away. But my client, Landever LLC, is proposing to resurrect Rivertown and develop it as a large master planned community. And we've been hard at work, and David has been doing most of the heavy lifting to try to put the pieces together for this development. Because as you can see, it's a big project and there's lots of infrastructure needs. It will involve the expenditure by Landever of millions of dollars of both transportation and utility infrastructure. The City Council approved a utility extension agreement last year, whereby the developer will install a force main and miles of water and sewer lines, which will facilitate the development of this property and also other properties in the area. Been working with city transportation, city utilities, and other developers in an effort to collaborate with some of these infrastructure improvements. We've requested this text change zoning to amend a number of the conditions. However, it will stay as R4 with conditions. We have requested an increase of the density cap from 850. There was a combination cap, whether a certain maximum number of units per acre or a hard number, but 850 was the max. We're going to 1,000. Under missing middle, if we went just for a low-scale residential, we could probably triple what we're requesting today. But we're not trying to triple it. We're trying to go from 850 to 1,000. And there'll be a lot of open space. Our condition says 20%, but what David and his firm are actually proposing is a conservation development whereby they will maintain 40% open space. Also, as Mr. Belk indicated, we will provide a 2-acre site for a public safety center. We provide a 50-foot average buffer around for the adjacent properties. We also removed several conditions that were either had been satisfied or are now obsolete or been replaced by UDO requirements, et cetera. And one of those was the dedication of a park or school site. And in fact, that actually was done, I think back in 2013, there was some property dedicated for that park site that is now located just to the north of this site. So that's already been done, so that's why it's not replicated in these new conditions. And Landover is interestingly proposing a mix of housing types, which I think is really interesting. And I want Mr. Mason to tell you about the housing makeout. I've sort of failed to go through my slides, but let me get to we talked about conditions. There's his graphic.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I do want to emphasize that we submitted our preliminary subdivision plans to the city on May 27th. So we are absolutely committed to the conservation development option and preserving 40% open space for this site. We've spent the last almost 3 years working on this site, and in the last couple of years working very closely with staff on both the utilities and also on transportation needs and improvements for this area. We are proposing a project that exclusively, I think, targets support for the missing middle, which is very much needed here in the city of Raleigh. You'll see a variety of home options here. These include townhomes with 1- and 2-car garages, duplexes, some single-family attached product, some age-targeted homes which will have primary bedrooms on the first floor, and a ranch-style home with some maintenance included, as well as single-family detached homes. So you'll see that offering these and the percentages that we're talking about really meet a variety of needs for a variety of consumers. So the community will be a very diverse community. It will also have a number of amenities, including the clubhouse that was mentioned, pool, perhaps some pickleball courts, playgrounds, passive parks, as well as an extensive greenway trail system that we'll put in that will connect to public sidewalks, as well as connectivity to the adjacent city-owned park site to the north. I also want to emphasize the commitment that we're making to the city of Raleigh and the adjacent property owners, as well as NCDOT. First and foremost, this site has remained undeveloped since 2006, and in large part because the original plan was for a gravity sewer system that needed to travel approximately 4 miles to the west and north of the site in order to make connectivity. We have worked very closely with former members of the staff, Mr. Brower, Mr. Sorrell, and others, and received approval for a regional pump station to be built on the northern end of our site with connectivity through a force main system that will connect down on Old Cruise Road. We're working currently now with Mr. Ham and others on the staff to coordinate that effort on the force main with a project that is planned for the city of Knightdale jurisdiction, which is immediately to the south of the site. So we have ongoing discussions there with them. So we're committed to doing that project at a cost of somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 to $8 million. Further, as you all know, I'm sure, is this corridor is growing very rapidly, and there are transportation needs in this area that go all the way to the 540 interchange and at various intersections along the way. We've worked for the past almost 2 years with NCDOT and your transportation staff to identify the improvements that we can participate in, and we're also committed to spending, probably north of $5 to $6 million here, and working in coordination with other developers. I've engaged other developers who are coming into this area to put together a plan so that we can address the needed transportation improvements that are necessary. They're legacy issues that have been out there for quite a while, so we are very committed to that. And in return, effectively, what we're asking for is an opportunity to do a slight increase to our density of approximately 100 and so units. I think right now our density is shown to be approximately 965 units. So we have the self-imposed cap, and we're actually staying, intentionally staying below that. Thank you.
So thank you, David. Just to conclude, this case is consistent with the comprehensive plan and the future land use map. And I believe it's reasonable and in the public interest, as it will bring new housing units, a diversity of housing types and prices in this area. And while preserving at least 20%, but as you've heard, the proposal was for 40% open space. And there'll be a lot of really great green areas, greenway, but also some active recreational areas. Provide millions of dollars of road and utility infrastructure, which will improve the traffic conditions on Buffalo and also facilitate, and if you saw this green slide, it's not quite as easy to see, but this area, you can see the outline of our site, but all that area to the right in the crosshatch green is the drainage basin that will, the extension of utility lines that Land Ever is proposing will facilitate future connections for that area as well as some to the south. We've also had 2 neighbor meetings. We've had very little attendance at those, no opposition. So with that, I would say that we're available for any questions that y'all might have.
Thank you, Ms. Maddox. Do we have any members of the public here to speak on this item? Seeing none, I'll open for questions or comments from commissioners. Commissioner Raines?
Thanks, Chair Fox. Question for transportation staff. I'll start out with thanks for the applicant for all the efforts and infrastructure and up to 40%. I applauded the 20%. If they're really intending on doing 40, I think that's admirable, and I just want to make that comment. But for staff, I noticed on the plan there's one connection to Buffalo Road, and this also may be a question for the applicant. Is that one connection, would that suffice for the volume and potential number of units and frequency of travel for this development?
That is a good question that I might take a second to review the TIA to make sure I know the answer to that. I'm going to do that and maybe ask the applicant to address that as well, because what I would expect maybe is this section here that's shown CX3 might include a street before the CX3 is actually built, and they're not showing that in this particular rendering. But usually we require 150 units maximum per point of access. And when there's future stubs, like many of these shown around the property, some of which are in the street plan, that can be taken into account. But I am also skeptical that it is possible to build all 1,000 without an additional point of connection. So let's let the applicant address that, and then I'll see if the TIA is any more specific.
Thank you.
Yes, I can address that. Our engineer, Withers and Ravenel, and our transportation engineer, Ramey Kemp, have been working in consultation with this design, and the access point does meet the requirements of the City of Raleigh and NCDOT for accessibility, as well as the different street sections that have stub outs to adjacent property. So those have been vetted previously and are consistent with the City of Raleigh requirements.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you. I'd also like to thank the applicant for the efforts. I think the 40% open space is, that caught me off guard too, so thank you for that. My question is transportation related as well. I noted that the staff report said the city would like to see a street stub to the Hodges Mill property, but this isn't being done, and I just wanted to know why that stub isn't being made.
I'm not aware of anyone making that request. There's a fairly wide floodplain there, for one thing, from a topography standpoint, and it is a park site that was originally transferred to the City of Raleigh in 2013. So I'm not familiar with the specifics of that request.
Okay, and maybe Jason, after you address Commissioner Raines, you can address it. What the staff report says is It does say the property was transferred to the city. Parks, Rec, and Cultural Resources would like a street stub to the southern boundary of this property. A street will help improve park access and improve transportation, public safety, resiliency, and public service efficiency outcomes in the area.
There is a stub at the northern end of that blue section, I think may address that condition that we put in without the knowledge that that condition or request was being made. That's adjacent to where the pump station will be located, and that street, I believe, stubs out at the property line on the northern side of the site.
I'll first address the question of the points of access. I don't see anywhere in the TIA where it says that a second point of access is required in any of these phases. So it may be that, and I know there's been the thing that is a little bit unique about this case is that we have a TIA for a subdivision. So it gets very much into site design issues. It's evaluated in consultation with NCDOT and the city's development engineering group, who's understanding that a subdivision plan is forthcoming and is thinking about site design issues. It's a little different. We usually see TIAs at this stage when they're more about infrastructure sufficiency and broad levels of whether or not a change in entitlement is appropriate. So I am not as familiar with the in the weeds engineering decisions that are happening behind the scenes. It does appear that maybe the expectation is that there's going to be a little bit of delay getting out of that the subdivision at certain times, but that's considered to be acceptable, the very, this is a relatively resilient street grid within the development. So while it is only one point of access, it's really this part of it is the crucial link, rather than a situation where it might be you go in a half a mile before you run into those issues. So I apologize, I can't address that any more directly. If there's a particular concern about that, maybe we need to come back with that. In terms of the question about the street stub, I don't know that the applicant would have been notified or would have seen that part of the staff report. It was put into the staff report pretty late in the process, right before the agenda was published. So I apologize that they weren't notified of that. Part of that was some misunderstanding about the nature of the changes of zoning conditions and the history of this land up here. I'm going to use their subdivision to highlight something here. I'm going to do it with this little flag here is kind of a protrusion of the city park property into their site, and it does cross the wetland that they're talking about. And if I'm not mistaken, it might be 30 feet wide. It's wide-ish for a greenway and too narrow for a street. I think has a history in the original development plan where that was expected to be a pedestrian connection. I think that's what the applicant is intending to do there as well. And they also mentioned this connection here of being required to stub a street to that developable land as well. What the Parks Department is thinking about is this is a pretty large park site. This lot up here, I'm gonna switch to this piece of land up here, and it goes a fair amount north. It's about 45 to 47, I think, acres. 49. Thank you, Bynum. And there is not a master plan for that property at this point. There isn't any awareness of any historical or sensitive environmental features. And given the distance between Buffalo Road on this side and the next street to the north of that the Hodges Creek Road property is connected to, it would be advantageous from the Parks Department to have a street stub to there. Now, that part of the discussion in the staff report is that's not a normal site plan requirement. They are exempted from block perimeter up against the city park, and they are probably also exempted from block perimeter because I'm going to guess, I'm not certain of this, that the drainage area of this system is more than a square mile. And if either of those things are the case, they wouldn't normally be able to be required to stub a street to that. But it's a deep enough property that if people are going to go, folks that live in this part of the development, say closer to the front of Buffalo Road, they want to go to the park, they're very likely to feel like driving is better than walking a mile, especially if they're carrying something. And so to have them drive through the neighborhood into the park, and then parks would like, I think, the flexibility, though, it may be a question that we need to bring parks in to talk a little bit more about how they do park planning. They might want to have a parking area inside the park on that side of it. There is the potential that street could go through all the way through the park. It's probably unlikely. But there are certainly environmental constraints that limit that. I don't think that stubbing to this implies that a much smaller development would then maybe be able to connect over the creek, but that's burdening a small development with a difficult challenge rather than a larger development with a difficult challenge. And so this stub is required by this stub, I'll point here, this stub is required by the block perimeter requirements. There is not one required in this area, but it would be helpful both for transportation reasons and for park access reasons to consider doing that, in addition to or instead of the pier, bike, and pedestrian connection that's envisioned with that layout. Does that address the questions?
Yes, thank you. Since the applicant wasn't aware of that prior to the staff report, is that something you're willing to look at and consider?
I'm really not sure how to respond to this. The very narrow easement that runs across from the park site is an easement for a greenway. And the original plans, and I think everyone's thought process all the way up to this point, including multiple discussions with the planning staff, is that future connectivity there would be pedestrian and for pedestrian and bicyclist. Our intention, and we've already created a plan of greenways within our community that would eventually connect back here, but also connect to public access. And so I might choose to disagree that if a resident who lives here wants to go to the park, that they may hop on their bicycle or they may walk and go over and enjoy the park when it was created, and they wouldn't drive through the park. I also don't know that that's the most direct access, with the park site being located effectively on the road to the north and a fairly large drainage basin wetland area that goes through there that would have to be disturbed in order to create connectivity for vehicular traffic. I mean, that would be a very massive undertaking from a cost standpoint that I don't think our project, given the nature of the other investments we're making with off-site water and sewer, bringing that to the site, and the millions of dollars of transportation cost that we're being asked to be burdened with, that we could also take that on as well. I just don't think it's a practical situation.
Thank you.
We do expect there to be a pedestrian connection and bicycle connection.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a couple of meetings with Parks and Recreation and planning staff and been very voluntarily supportive of saying, work with us, tell us what you would like to do, how you would like to connect this. Here's our greenway plan as it exists today. If you would like to tweak that or change it around some, we're completely open to that so that we can create that connectivity for when the park is eventually developed in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Is it the desire of the commission to perhaps defer this to our next meeting 2 weeks out to get a little bit of clarity?
I would say yes, except it seems like the applicant is comfortable with what they've proposed. So if the applicant would like further conversations with city staff, then I'm good with that. But if they're good,
I think
if
we're
they don't plan to change anything.
pretty confident with this proposal and would like to move it on today if possible.
Excellent, thank you. Would you like to make a motion?
Sure. Let me find it. Let me pull it up. If someone else has it up, feel free to jump ahead of me.
Commissioner Raines?
I'll jump in. Thanks, Chair Fox. Based on the application, I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated June 4th, 2022, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of this zoning amendment Z9121.
Thank you, Commissioner Raines. And do we have a second?
Second.
Second, Commissioner Bennett. Commissioner Raines has offered a motion to approve TCZ 9121. Commissioner Bennett has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, by show of hands, those in support? Those opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the last item in new business, which is F.3, rezoning case Z622 on Jones Sausage Road. We will start with a staff presentation.
Good morning, JP Mantloff, Planning and Development. This is rezoning case Z622. It's for 3 parcels, one on Jones Sausage Road, one on Integrity Drive, and one on Ardmore Road. The request is to rezone approximately 3.5 acres from R4 and IX5 CU with a special highway overlay district to IX5 CU, and the Planning Commission deadline for action is August 13th. Zoning in the area is primarily industrial, so on 3 sides there's sort of industrial mixed-use zoning, and then there's also heavy industrial zoning just to the west. The residential zoning kind of to the northwest is the St. Mary's subdivision, which was platted in 1964 but never constructed, and that zoning represents that subdivision. Here's an aerial of the site. So the site's currently vacant. And again, that subdivision to the north that I mentioned as the St. Mary's subdivision, that was never constructed. There are some commercial uses along Jones Sausage to the south, so a couple of fast food restaurants and a gas station, and then some industrial uses just to the west. Here's a couple of street views of the site. So again, just showing that the site is currently vacant. One view is looking sort of north at the corner of Integrity and Jones Sausage, and the other is looking south on Jones Sausage. There is one proposed condition, so that condition would prohibit several uses that would otherwise be allowed in the industrial mixed-use district. The request would increase potential residential density, increase potential office square footage, and office and retail square footage, in addition to the potential increase in industrial square footage. The site has a lower walk and bike score than the city average, and no transit service is currently available at the site. Transportation costs are about average with the city, and there is a lower job proximity at the site than the city average. Again, no transit service here. The request would add some potential housing units on the site. It does not include subsidized units or permit a variety of housing types, so the IX district would only allow housing above the first floor of a mixed-use building, and so attached townhomes would all not be allowed on the site. Smaller units would be allowed within that mixed-use building, but the site is not within walking distance of transit. The site is within a USDA food desert. There's a higher percentage of people of color in this census tract, and change in median rent has been at a higher rate than the citywide average. The requested IX district is mostly consistent with the future land use map, which has designated the site as business and commercial services for about 2/3 of the site. The remaining third is designated as low-scale residential, and so for the most part, the request is consistent with that business and commercial services designation. For the portion of the site that is low-scale residential, there would be a amendment to the future land use if this requests were approved. There's no urban form designation on the site. The request is inconsistent with the comprehensive plan overall, and again, consistent with that future land use map. Consistent policies are mostly around the future land use map consistency, and also the preservation of industrial land in an area that's well suited to have those industrial uses. There are inconsistent policies, so These policies sort of speak to zoning for industrial uses, sort of next to properties that are zoned residential. The transition of density, so this request would allow a 5-story building sort of next to properties that are zoned R4. So there's a sharp contrast in density there. And then buffering requirements, acknowledging that there's the plan sort of calls for buffering between industrial and higher impact commercial uses in residential properties. A lot of those inconsistencies are somewhat mitigated by the fact that the adjacent residential, which those policies are sort of referring to, are vacant right now, and there are challenges to developing this subdivision. So it was platted in 1964, and there is a fragmented ownership pattern, and so development of the subdivision would be challenging based on the requirements for right-of-way and sort of the fragmented ownership pattern. So those inconsistencies are sort of referring to what's the colors on the map, but just acknowledging that that site is currently vacant and would be challenging to develop in the future. As I mentioned earlier, the request is partially inconsistent with future land use map, so that portion of the site where it's designated low-scale residential would be amended to business and commercial services if the request is approved. No outstanding issues, and your deadline for action is August 13th, so you have a couple meetings before that deadline. And happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Mansoff. Next, we'll hear from the applicant team. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Worth Mills, here on behalf of the owner and the rezoning applicant. This rezoning creates a potentially safer development than what could be built today by creating 3 access points on 3 different rights-of-way on a corner lot within a large industrial center with both heavy and light industrial uses. So as JP mentioned, the assemblage is just under 3.5 acres. It is currently split zone between IX5CU with the SHOD 2 overlay and the R4 zoning district as well. We're proposing to rezone the entire assemblage to industrial mixed use, 5 stories, conditional use, removing that SHOD 2 overlay as well. That's going to give us a consistent zoning district throughout the assemblage, and it's going to remove a burdensome overlay district that does not have much applicability here. It also provides the applicant with the flexibility to develop all existing types of uses that are currently along Integrity Drive and at a height maximum that is consistent with surrounding zoning. So this is an aerial of the site. Again, it fronts on Integrity Drive, Jones Sausage Road, and that Ardmore Drive, which is the paper residential street that is yet to be constructed. There are warehousing, office, and outdoor storage of heavy equipment uses along the outer perimeter of Integrity Drive. There are some additional highway retail type uses on the interior of the site and as you approach the intersection with Jones Sausage Road. So there are Burger King, Bojangles, gas station, or cart-oriented types of businesses. So this aerial just zoomed in a little bit further. You can see that it's vacant. It's partially wooded. Here you can also see these 2 lots, which were originally part of the 1964 subdivision, St. Mary's, that have since been recombined with that heavy industrial zone property on which they've located a stormwater pond that serves both lots. Also note the mature trees that are growing within that paper street. As JP mentioned, this subdivision has been platted but vacant for almost 60 years now. This street view here is from the intersection of Integrity Drive and Jones Sausage, looking into that 3511 Integrity Drive parcel. Wooded on the interior of the site, cleared around the perimeter today. Here is the intersection of Jones Sausage and Auburn Church, which is to the left of your screen. On the right-hand side is that Ardmore Street, which again blocked off, not developed, and is currently wooded. As JP mentioned, this subdivision was platted in 1964. There's been no discernible progress on any residential development here since that time. As I mentioned, the only development so far has been those parcels that were recombined with heavy industrial properties to locate the stormwater pond. So we do not foresee any changes to that, again, given the multiple property owners to date. This slide here just shows the range of nearby uses. I pulled this from Google Maps. You can see Pepsi Bottling Ventures to our southeast. You have a healthy mix of light industrial uses to the east-northeast. You have CAT development equipment along Integrity Drive. So again, everything that's been developed around here since the platting of that subdivision has been either mixed light industrial or heavy industrial. And the rezoning to IX5 for all three parcels here is compatible with the surrounding area and those uses. This slide shows the zoning as well as the SHOD 2 overlay. As I noted, there are heavy industrial zone properties on the outer perimeter of Integrity Drive, and those do abut. Many of those lots that are currently zoned R4 today. On the interior of the Integrity Drive right-of-way, those properties today, like the Integrity Drive property that's subject to this rezoning, are zoned industrial mixed-use, 5-story height limit, conditional use. Those conditions do not limit height below 5 stories. Regarding the SHOD 2 overlay buffer, the UDO says that those overlays are intended to extend 1,000 to 1,500 feet from a major access corridor, which would be I-40 there, just to our, well, not just to our west, but this property is approximately a third of a mile from I-40, so over 1,750 feet. The SHOD 2 requirements would force the owner and developer to put in a 25-foot protective yard that would be established as tree conservation area. The rules in the SHOD 2 are that if the trees are not present, then you plant them and then you declare them as TCA. So again, the SHOD 2 buffer here is not offering many benefits given its distance from Interstate 40, as well as really shrinking the developable area of this site if there is a 25-foot SHOD 2 overlay buffer that must also be planted. Given the, and again, just kind of to speak to the congruity or the compatibility of the rezoning to the residential zone property to our north, you can see that a handful of those properties have been zoned neighborhood mixed use already. And given the IH zoning that's adjacent to many of those lots, given the breadth of industrial uses that have been developed since 1964 here, it seems highly unlikely that there's going to be any type of residential development as it's laid out today. This could serve as additional light industrial property perhaps, or some type of neighborhood commercial center. But for single family residential, from a marketability standpoint, it seems highly unlikely that somebody would go in and build 100, 200 new homes in this area. As JP mentioned, we are partially consistent with the future land use map. You can see the wide swath of purple there, designating that as business and commercial services. And again, we don't foresee any development on that area that's deemed low-scale residential, at least not at that future land use map designation. So to conclude my presentation, this rezoning, again, it opens up access onto Ardmore Road, which is currently a paper street and not constructed. It gives the applicant the ability to, again, continue the industrial uses and that industrial use pattern that we've seen over the last 50 to 60 years at a height that's present today, and that uses are present today within that Integrity Drive loop. So we do think that this is reasonable and in the public interest. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. Are there any members of the public who are here to speak on this item? No? Then I will move on to questions and comments from commissioners. Do we have any questions or comments? Generally, with a case like this, I would ask if you'd considered reducing the massing on those two northern parcels based on the adjacent single-family zoning. However, I'm going to acknowledge that it is very unlikely that someone's going to pick up those plans from 1964 and proceed as is. I would imagine there would be some different type of development that might be contemplated for that area in the future.
And Chair, this obviously something that we would have looked at as well if there was some possibility of residential development there. Just given that it is R4 zoning today, when the developer were to go in with a site plan, there would be the neighborhood transitions that come into play where you have some type of fence or wall with some landscaping. You have 50-foot use prohibition, and then you have that height transition at that 45-degree angle, extending, I think, for another 50 feet. So even without additional conditions, there will be some types of massing protections to the currently zoned R4 property.
Thank you for that clarification. Are there any questions or comments from other commissioners? Mr. Miller?
Yes, thank you. I did not see an engagement report in the agenda materials. I just wanted to confirm there were no members of the public signed up to speak with respect to the neighbors, and that no one else from the public also reached out or to oppose this project for any of the neighboring parcels.
Yeah, that's right. There were no comments in the engagement portal, and so there was nothing to attach.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no further questions or comments for either the staff or the applicant, I'd like to entertain a motion.
I'll move to approve rezoning case Z622 and to adopt the proposed consistency statement contained in the agenda materials dated June 14th, 2022.
And do we have a second? Commissioner Dattell? Commissioner Miller has offered a motion to approve Z622. Commissioner Dattell has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, by show of hands, those in favor? And any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. All right, moving on to approval of the minutes. In the backup, we have the minutes from the May 24th, 2022 meeting. Are there any additions, comments, or edits recommended by commissioners? If not, I will entertain a motion.
Motion to approve the minutes.
And a second. And by show of hands, those in favor? And any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. And moving on to report from the chair. We were going to do the election of officers today. Seeing we have a couple of perhaps significant absences today, I was going to recommend we move that to our next meeting, if everyone is okay with that. In the meantime, think of who might be a great chair, because the lady at the microphone is really tired. Okay. Other than that, I have no other report. Is there a report from any members? No? All right, seeing none. Report from the Assistant Director.
Thank you. You've got a written report in your backup that details the recent City Council actions. I'd only note additionally that you've got another meeting on June 28th. We've got Committee of the Whole that will happen next week on the 24th, I believe, and then you go on your summer break on your hiatus. So I anticipate that you're going to have a fairly large agenda on the 28th to move through a fair amount of work before the break.
Awesome.
Is it 23rd? Okay, thanks.
The cow, yes, 23rd.
Yeah. Yep, so to be clear, COW meeting on the 23rd, next meeting on the 28th, robust agenda. Excellent. All right, is there anything else for the good of the order?
Do we expect there'll also be a text change meeting on Tuesday, the 21st? Sorry, did you just address that?
I would redirect that question to the chairperson of the Text Change Committee.
Okay, I expect that there will be. We paused on one because we went so fast through all of the past ones. We caught up with the latest staff materials, but I'll let you know.
Okay.
Great.
I believe so. I would say let's plan on it.
Okay.
I'll follow up with you. Make sure it circles back around.
Sounds good.
Excellent. All right, thank you. If there is nothing else then for the good of the order, this concludes our meeting. Thank you.